honor to be here and an honor to speak after all of those wonderful presentations preceding me. I think much of what I say is certainly going to be very much in line with what the previous speakers have said, and hopefully complementary, providing a new perspective on the ways in which we can empower women and strengthen families. And the area that I want to focus on in my presentation is the topic of the rights of parents as the primary educators of their children, a topic that's been the subject of my research for quite some time. And I want to frame that topic in relation to the well-being of women and children. I want to make the case that strong defense of the rights of parents to raise their children in accordance with their values is extremely important for empowering women and for the well-being of children, in a particular way, girls. So just to give you a sense of where I'm going with this, first I want to explain in a little bit more detail why the issue of parental rights connects to the issue of women's empowerment, which we're talking about in this session today. Second, I want to offer a kind of deeper account of why it is that parents have rights, why it is that parents are the primary educators of their children, and what that means. And then lastly, I want to talk about the connection between strong protections for parental rights and the well-being of children, especially of girls. But first, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, we're talking about the same thing, let me just offer a working definition of what I mean by the term parental rights. So first of all, parental rights protect parental child-rearing authority. So when I say that parents have rights, I mean that parents are the ones who primarily have the right and the responsibility to make decisions about what is in the best interest of their children and to raise their children in line with those decisions. Right? Parents, and not the state, not any other organization, have the primary right and duty to make decisions about the upbringing and education of their children. Parents, parental authority over children, as I said, is prior to that of the state. The state does have a role, but its state's role is secondary. It's subsidiary to that of parents, meaning that it's secondary to parents' role and aimed at helping parents carry out their educational task, not usurping or undermining the authority of the parents, because that's bad both for the parents and the children, as I'll explain later. All right, so now that we kind of have a common working definition, let me explain how parental rights connects to the issue of women's empowerment. And there's a certain obvious connection, which is, of course, half of parents, literally 50% biologically of parents are women. But in practice, and I think as, notwithstanding the very important things we've heard about the importance of fathers, the reason why we need to talk about the importance of fathers is that often they're not the ones primarily involved in the raising of their children. More often, because of biology, it's the woman who's always there, and it's the woman who, either by choice or by necessity, in a sense, the child-rearing responsibility tends to fall more heavily on her. So, since parental rights protect the ability of parents to raise children as they see fit, to raise them in accordance with their beliefs, empowering parents to exercise their parental authority is in many ways, in practice, more often than not about empowering women, who sometimes by necessity, but also often by choice, are the ones who tend to be on the front lines of raising the children and educating the children. And this just to give some sense of why very often, even in places like the United States, women very often prefer to spend more of their time to take on a more primary role in child rearing and educating children than men do. Not that men aren't important, but just to recognize those complementary relationships. And this isn't every woman, but many statistics show that a large majority of women prioritize family and the care of children over work outside the home in a way that fewer men do. So 56% of U.S. women with children under 18 say that they would prefer to stay at home and raise their children, by comparison with 26% of men. That's a recent Gallup poll. A couple of smaller polls give even higher numbers. A poll from the UK says 75% of women would stay at home with their children if they could afford to financially. A poll by Forbes Woman and thebump.com, 84% of women said they would stay home with their children if they could afford to. Those are very, very high numbers. It just gives an indication of how, particularly for women, the development of those strong bonds with their children is so important in their overall life satisfaction. And so I think it's not too much to say that close relationships with children are a key component of a meaningful life for most women. Again, not all women, but for most women, this is a central area of their lives, and so protecting that area is going to be crucial for the well-being and the empowerment of women. And so mothers suffer and are disempowered in a central aspect of their lives when parental rights are not respected. Just to give you one case to see this in real life, there's a case which perhaps some of you have heard of, a boy by the name of Dominic Johansson. You have a picture of Dominic here in 2009 on an airplane with his mother is right there, and here's Dominic with his mother Annie and his father Christer. They're a Swedish family. Now in 2009, when young Dominic and his parents were on a plane bound for Annie's native country of India, a SWAT team, basically, of armed Swedish police came onto the plane and took Dominic, screaming, right, by force away from his parents into custody. The reason was that Christer and Annie had been homeschooling 7-year-old Dominic at that time, and now homeschooling is not legal in Sweden, but at that time it actually was legal, but disapproved of by the authorities. So they had been homeschooling him against the wishes of the authorities, and they had delayed a few of his immunizations because for health reasons and other reasons. And so on those grounds, the SWAT team came in and forcibly took Dominic out of their custody. And actually one of the reasons why they were moving to India was to be freed of those pressures, and so that they could raise Dominic as they saw fit. Of course, having Dominic taken into custody by the authorities changed everything. They have not been able to regain custody of their son. In fact, they haven't seen him since 2010. And as of now, their parental rights are officially terminated, meaning Dominic could be adopted by another family. But they are, of course, fighting this in the courts, but it's heart-wrenching. So Annie told a reporter about this, I can just hear the screams of my child all the time. And when she has to talk about the incident of Dominic being taken forcibly from them, she still sometimes has panic attacks. She says, how can you live without your children? It's devastated our life. This has devastated everything in our life. And so again, you can see certainly this has been a tragedy for the whole family, but in a special way, it threw Annie into a depression. I mean, she's suffered so much from having her dear child taken away from them. It's a clear case of disempowerment of women by the failure to respect parental rights. So now that I've explained briefly why parental rights are also an issue of women's empowerment, let me just talk a little bit about why parents have rights in the first place. Now, it's kind of widely accepted that parental rights exist, and parental rights are mentioned both directly and indirectly in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Declaration states that the family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society entitled to protection by society and the state. I'll argue that one of those protections is precisely protecting that natural sphere of authority within which the parents, as the heads of the family, have authority over that internal family sphere, and the state shouldn't encroach on that. That's important for recognizing the family as a fundamental group of society. That's a consequence of that. Secondly, the Declaration states that everyone has the right to freedom of thought and conscience. I'll explain a little bit later why I think parental rights importantly relate to freedom of conscience and freedom of religion, because For parents, one of their most important conscientious obligations, and for many also seen as a religious obligation, is precisely in the way in which they raise their children. And then specifically, the Declaration states that parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. So there's wide agreement on this in principle, but again, in practice, we see in countries like Sweden that now have homeschooling is illegal, likewise Germany, Spain, and other countries the status is not quite secure, and there are other issues as well, which I'll talk about. These principles are not often put into practice. But before I talk a little bit more about that, I think it's important to explain why, right? Aside from just international agreements and conventions and things, but why is it that parents are the primary educators? Is it just a matter of convention? Did we just agree on this? Is it just a matter of, pragmatism? Kids are biologically kind of born to these parents. It seems like the easiest way to figure out how to raise them, right, is to just let the parents do it. Or is there something deeper? Is there a real moral foundation to this right? You can think about it another way. Why should you get to take your own baby home from the hospital? Why not just, let's say you go into the hospital, you give birth, and then the state just randomly assigns you some baby from the nursery. Why does it matter to you that it be your baby? And why do you have, not just why does it matter, but why would you think it an egregious failure to respect your rights if the state said, oh no, we've got another family that's more competent than you, they're going to take the baby, right? Why would you think, why would almost everybody think that that's a complete failure to respect a fundamental human right? Well, I think that's because we recognize that there's something so crucial, so important about that fundamental tie between parents and children, which in the first instance is a biological tie. And so I want to argue that the authority that parents have over their children relates to that biological tie. I'll say a little bit about adoption in a minute and show how that fits in, but in the central case, right, children come from biological parents, and so that's where this natural family structure and authority structure of the family comes into play in the first place. So I think about authority basically as coinciding with the obligations that you have to make decisions on behalf of others. So there are many types of authority. Often, how do you get that obligation and right to make decisions on others' behalf? Well, in the political context, there's a certain format, right? There are certain things that are stipulated about decision-making procedures, elections, succession, whatever it might be. But there may also be forms of authority which occur naturally, not by a kind of consent or stipulation or agreement, but by the very nature of a relationship that exists. And so I think that the case of parents and children is one of those cases, that there's a natural relationship of authority of parents over their children that's based on the fact that parents are the ones who have the strongest and most direct responsibility for the well-being of their child. Right, it's clear that parents are the ones who have the closest relationship to the child, at least initially, right? It's the biological parents who are the ones who have that closest personal relationship to the child. And that's what gives them the greatest responsibility for that child. And then given that taking care of a child means making decisions on behalf of that child, exercising authority over that child, until the point at which the child becomes an adult and can make decisions on his or her own, that then means that exercising this responsibility implies authority. And so thinking about this kind of natural structure, one image that's been used, was used by Thomas Aquinas, and I think it's a beautiful image to think about this authority structure, is to think about the family as a kind of spiritual womb. You have a kind of beautiful sculpture here of the parents with their hands and legs kind of encircling the children in this protective sphere. And so human beings, when you think about it, they're not complete at birth. right? Far from it, right? Birth is in a way just the beginning. So that period of gestation physically in the womb of the mother is just the first stage of a very, very long human gestation, right? The gestation to human maturity doesn't take 9 months. It takes a good 18 years, sometimes more, right? And it's that whole period of human gestation which, in continuity with the physical gestation, ought to take place within the protective sphere of the family. And so like the physical womb, the family is a kind of spiritual womb, a protective sphere within which children can grow to maturity. And that protected sphere, again, metaphorically portrayed here in this sculpture, is the sphere in which parents are protecting their children, including protecting them by making decisions on their behalf, by exercising their parental authority. And so, just as we would think it, and it would be a danger to a child to prematurely be removed from the womb of the mother, well, likewise, it's a danger for a child to have premature coercive interference into the protected sphere of the family. And so this brings us to a kind of model of authority in which we don't think about authority as a pie, in which it's just on a single plane, and so if you think about authority over children, if the state has half the pie, the family has the other half. I don't think that's the right way to look at it. I think we should think about authority over children on a kind of nesting doll model. It's not just a plane where it's half and half. There's a kind of inner concentric circle and then an outer circle. And so if you think about this, it's kind of like the way that international relations works. Right? In international relations, politically, right, each of us is primarily under the authority of our own national government. And it's only indirectly, right, via our own government that we're subject to supranational authorities. And so the UN, as far as I know, doesn't have any direct authority over me as an individual. The UN's authority over me would always be mediated through my own government. And so I think in many ways, the relationship of the child to the state is similar. That the state, as such, only has this indirect authority over the children, mediated through that primary authority of the parents. So likewise, children are primarily under the authority of their parents and only indirectly under the authority of the political communities. And I also think the international relations analogy is instructive because it helps us to see when it is justified for the state to step in. And those are cases of abuse and neglect defined non-ideologically, or cases in which there's a serious threat to the public order. For instance, if it's clear that parents are training their children to be terrorists or something like that, setting up a terrorist school, that would be a reason to have the state step in. And this is analogous, I think, to serious human rights violations or threats to international peace, which would justify intervening in the internal affairs of other nations. So the analogy is not perfect, but it helps to see that we're not looking at a kind of flat pie model of authority, but rather one of concentric spheres or nesting dolls in which the parents are the ones with the primary authority within their sphere, which includes primarily the raising and education of the children. I mentioned before that I think you can also make a case of parental rights as a type of conscious rights. Since parents' obligation to educate their children is a serious one, a personal one, a central obligation in their lives, and for many it's also seen as a direct religious obligation to raise their children in accordance with their values, in accordance with their faith. When policies make it difficult or impossible for parents to educate their children in line with the dictates of their consciences, this is a serious threat to parents' conscience rights and to parents' religious freedom. So, for instance, a policy of mandatory comprehensive sexual education with no opt-out right for parents, that is a serious threat to the rights of a parent who, you could imagine a parent who doesn't have the money to send the child to an alternate private school, or doesn't have the ability or the freedom to school their child at home. And they're faced with this situation of sending their children into an environment which they think could be very seriously morally poisonous, could lead to an understanding of sexuality that they believe could be dangerous to their children, especially perhaps to their daughters. And so you can imagine the kind of angst that parents, especially mothers, would feel at having to send their children into this environment to hear these things that they think are potentially seriously harmful, but they have no power to do anything about it, right? It's a deep sense of disempowerment, a deep sense of kind of violation of their rights of conscience as parents. If you think about it analogously, imagine that you were forced to send your children to a school in which they were serving something poisonous for lunch, and you weren't allowed to send a lunch with them. They had to eat the school lunch, right? It's the same sort of idea. When you're forced to send your children into an environment where you think the atmosphere is morally poisonous, that's deeply distressing for parents. And now, lastly, you might ask, okay, but what about the children, right? You talk so much about parents, it's really, we're talking about the education and upbringing of children. Shouldn't the principle just be what's best for the children? And I want to argue that, on balance, protecting parents' rights is also protecting the well-being of children. It's protecting the best environment within which children can thrive. So first, protecting that spiritual womb of the family from outside interference is important for the physical, psychological, and moral health of children, just like protecting the physical womb of the mother is important for the fetus growing within. Secondly, the permanent and identity-defining relationship that exists between, in the central case, biological parents and their children makes the child in an important way personally dependent on the biological parents. Again, I'll say something about adoption in a minute, for the ideal fulfillment of the child's developmental needs. And then thirdly, children benefit from being raised within a coherent value system and receiving authoritative guidance from parents all the way until adulthood. I'll flesh all of these out briefly. Now, first, just this idea about why biological parents matter, and in many ways this relates to some of the things that Dr. Burrick was saying, that when a biological parent is absent, that's an objective loss for the child in terms of understanding his or her own identity, his ancestry, background, heritage, all the things that you can come to know about yourself from knowing your biological background. And some evidence from that comes from studies that have been done on children who are donor conceived. Children conceived through reproductive technologies in which, in the case of this study, the father, the genetic father, was a sperm donor, an anonymous sperm donor. And so now this study looked at adults who had been conceived in this way, who, because of that, had no knowledge of who their father was, and certainly no actual personal interaction with that father. And it found that children conceived in this way are more confused about their identity, more isolated also from the families that are raising them, than those who are raised by their biological parents, or even those raised by adoptive parents. Nearly 2/3 of those interviewed agree my sperm donor is half of who I am. Right? If you might think, oh, who is this guy? I mean, he's nobody, right? He's just a sperm, right? It doesn't mean anything. Well, maybe not to him, although actually some studies show that it does. But to the child, absolutely means something. That's half of who they are. That's a key to part of their identity. And then in terms of kind of hard outcomes, like delinquency and substance abuse and so on, donor-conceived children fare worse than their peers raised in intact biological families or in adopted families. And so, as I promised, you can ask, okay, well, what about adoption? And a lot more can be said about this. It's complex, but the key point here is that sometimes, due to tragedy, due to many circumstances often beyond our control, biological parents simply are not able to give their child the life, the education, the upbringing, the situation that they know that child needs to thrive. And in those cases, the biological parents may find that the best way to fulfill their obligation to their child is to provide that child with another family that's much better equipped to raise the child than they. That's always a difficult decision for biological parents, but it's not one that necessarily at all implies indifference or neglect or lack of love, often on the contrary. And that, I think, is part of the difference between adoption and, say, a donor conception scenario, where in adoption the parents are giving that child out of love, as opposed to donor conception where the donor really just is not even thinking about the child. And so adoptive parents are true parents, right? They're forming this deep bond with their children. They're configuring their child's identity, not biologically, but certainly morally, psychologically, intellectually. They are true parents, but the difference between them and biological parents is that their obligations and rights stem initially from their choice to take on that commitment of parenthood, rather than from a biological tie. But once they have made that choice, once they've taken on that commitment, their relationship is then essentially the same, and they have all the same rights as biological parents do. Now, lastly, I want to explain why I think the kind of coherent, authoritative guidance that parents can give to their children if their parental rights are respected is very important for child well-being. And this is a controversial point because a lot of people will say, don't children have a right to a kind of autonomy education, an education that ensures that children are exposed to a variety of views, diverse views that are different from, perhaps in conflict with, the values that the family is trying to pass on. And I want to argue that while I actually think that it is important at the right time and in the right way for children to be exposed to diverse viewpoints, I also think that when this is done in a way that fails to respect parental rights, and when it's done against the wishes of parents, in a situation in which the parents think it could be harmful, when it pits children against their parents in this way, that ultimately it is, on balance, harmful for children's well-being. And so autonomy education, and you could add in here things, again, like comprehensive sex education against the wishes of parents and so on, that these things on balance can do more harm than good. Even if you think that the opposing view that's being provided is the right one. Why? Because according to the evidence that we have from psychology and neurobiology, we know that children, and even well into adolescence, lack the maturity needed to rationally assess the comparative merits of competing value systems. Right? So it's hard enough for any of us to rationally assess, opposing viewpoints and decide which one is right. But for an adolescent, it's especially difficult. Why? Because adolescents are short-sighted, more prone to high-risk behaviors, due not just to sort of immaturity in terms of character, but also just in terms of their brain development. The prefrontal cortex is still underdeveloped and not playing the primary role in decision-making well through adolescence, which could also relate to some of the reasons why when 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds get married, their decision-making isn't yet mature enough to make that lifelong commitment, right? And that's why you kind of see this curve that once you make it to 20, 21, 22, before you decide to get married, you're much better off. It's partially because of the brain development that's occurring in those years. And so it's fostering skepticism of parents' values in school or in other forums, even if the parents' values are worse than the other values that are being taught. Still, that can be harmful to children on balance because it can disrupt the child's fragile sense of self, which is based on the kind of primary culture that they're receiving within their family, and this can leave them prey to external influences and unable to make and keep personal commitments, which are very important for overall well-being in life. You sort of shatter their sense of who they are, and then they just become totally prey to peer pressure and other sorts of pressures that are completely unhelpful to them. You also find from studies on parenting styles and the sorts of parenting styles that are most helpful for children in terms of child outcomes that authoritative parenting with a blend of warmth and responsiveness, but clear and coherently enforced guidelines is the best across the board for children. But that requires that we maintain and support parental authority. And so if the authority of parents, if what parents are teaching their children at home is being undermined or contradicted in schools or in other areas, that's going to undermine parental authority and then harm children. And again, as others have said, I have all the studies if anybody wants to see more of the data on this. And then lastly, creating a rift between parents and children by educating children to kind of be critical of their parents' values erodes trust, affection, and open communication between parents and children in a way that can be harmful, and studies show especially harmful to girls. Studies have shown that girls' mental health, even more than boys, is especially vulnerable to family stressors, to difficulties in communicating with parents, and so on. So when prematurely children are being told things that can kind of create a value rift between them and their parents that can undermine this important protective family relationship and family communication. And then lastly, again, complementing what Dr. Merrick was saying, parent-child closeness, certainly father-child closeness, but also mother-child closeness, reduces the risk of teen pregnancy, which in terms of women's empowerment is very, very important, right, in terms of getting the sequencing right in that regard. And then coherence overall is crucial, right, that coherence of the primary family culture, but also ensuring that as much as possible, all the different environments in which a child is engaged are kind of speaking with the same voice, especially about matters of values. Sociologist Francis Yanni did a large landmark study where he showed that the most important determinant of how adolescence will be experienced and with what results is how the various social contexts of the community are integrated in terms of the continuity and congruence of their values, norms, and beliefs. In other words, adolescents are best academically, psychosocially, professionally, when family, school, church, and peer groups are all offering a coherent set of values and boundaries. And this can only happen when strong supports for parental rights are in place, because this can only happen when parents are empowered to ensure that the schools and other organizations that are helping them in their parental role share their own values, right? So this, again, requires policies that allow for school choice, that allow for homeschooling, that don't mandate controversial curricula without an option for parents to opt their children out if they consider it harmful, and so on. So just to conclude, right, making decisions about what is in the best interest of children is primarily the right and responsibility of parents, not the state. The state's role is to facilitate parents' educational and caregiving tasks, but not to usurp them, not to undermine them. Protecting parents' rights enables parents to pass on their values to their children, and so it protects the conscience rights and the religious freedom of parents. It also safeguards family intimacy, parent-child connectedness, and parental authority, again, all of which have been shown to be very important for the well-being of children. And finally, protecting parents' rights empowers mothers and helps women and children, especially girls, to flourish. Thank you very much.